blackberries in July, and it ended up with that name. First of all, it's a little bit of an accident. Well, there aren't any accidents, probably. It seemed like an accident. It was the first piece that I wrote, and I remember taking it to Jessica at Xenon for lunch one day, and she just looked at me and said, "Oh, I knew it," you know, and it was okay, and it's been revised, hugely revised since those days. But Blackberries in July is the archetype for this place, and the reason it is because you pick blackberries in July because that's when the blackberries that actually really, really belong here are ripe. Most people tell you they pick blackberries in August or September, and I pick blackberries then too. But there's a blackberry that ripens in July, and if you really glued into your place, it's apparent to you that that's the right thing to be doing, even though it's very difficult to pick enough of them to do much with. The other part to that is, you know, I tell people I'm a fourth generation Oregonian, and there was a time when that was a kind of a point of pride for me, and I tell people, you know, just every bad thing that was ever uttered about Californians probably came out of my mouth at one time or another, and I have a closet full of plaid shirts and the whole 9 yards. But I've gotten over that, and the fact is, being a fourth generation Oregonian, there's a huge burden of responsibility associated with that. And that's to share with you what I know about my place so that you can become even more a part of it than you might have been otherwise. And so, if you understand why I picked blackberries in July, you'll understand a lot about my place. Your place. This morning, I was free to drive leisurely through the Coast Range because my teaching job at the local community college was part-time. The pay was low and the benefits nil, but I had desperately needed employment because the research money that had brought me back to Oregon was drying up. That grant had been a spring pond full of promise and possibilities, but when the rains finally end in summer, pools not fed by permanent water evaporate. Not long ago, I found myself gasping in the stagnant puddle of my mismanaged career. And while the worst of this emotional drought seemed to have passed, I was still a recovering melancholic and needed to watch my step. My friend Kara, one of the few people I still know from kindergarten days, had recently given me a very sound piece of advice. Find some joy every day. Simple wisdom. But I was long overdue for a deposit in my bliss bank. On the top of the ridge, my plodding existentialist angst was eventually overcome by a blaring message from my bladder that the time had come to stop and enrich the local nitrogen cycle. Reluctantly, I slid my foot to the brake pedal, bringing the car to a crunching halt at the gravel intersection of 5 logging roads. Stopping is a rare event for me, usually reserved for pressing biological needs, if you know what I mean. Generally, these involuntary interludes are an inconvenience, although they have led to some unexpected and seemingly coincidental outcomes. Chanterelles, deer, wildflowers, and waterfowl have caught me in various stages of undress. Of course, my bodily functions have nothing to do with these fortunate encounters beyond forcing me to pause in my reckless tumble through life so that the world can stand upright and still and things can come into sharper focus. This enforced version of Zen worked this morning. I was alone and wandered to the edge of the isolated road, pretending to be looking for something. From the chaotic undergrowth, a wild blackberry bush had sent an exploratory tendril onto the shoulder where it basked like a thin green snake. A dozen multicolored berries glowed in the subdued light, most of them pie cherry red and tart enough to pull my cheeks into a permanent pucker, but 4 were dark purple, tinged with wine, just barely ripe. A small warm flash that accompanies unexpected good luck radiated from the center of my chest. Without thinking, I picked the right berries, popped all of them into my mouth, and bit down. My head filled with tart, musky blackberry essence that quickly became a time machine, carrying me back through the decades to a logged-over hillside on a sunny July day. Mom and Grammy were blackberry picking from prickly, bejeweled vines cascading over large stumps. My brothers and I were very young and were completely absorbed in blackberry eating rather than filling a bucket for later. There must have been enough berries for everyone because in the evening, a warm pie cooled on the kitchen counter, purple juice oozing from a sugar-speckled crust. Mom spent the next several days probing her berry-stained fingers with a needle, trying to remove the tiny, nearly invisible thorns. Blackberry picking can have unforeseen consequences. My 4 small blackberries came from a vine deeply rooted in these hills. Grammy's yearly goal was to find enough berries for a pie by 4th of July, a daunting task because wild blackberries peak later in the month. This sacrament of early summer likely goes back another generation when my great-grandparents settled in the upper Smith River Valley. Since the arrival of my ancestors in the Coast Range near the close of the 19th century, the blackberry flora of the Pacific Northwest has changed dramatically. The Coast Range in those days had only one species of any significance as a food resource, an endemic that I grew up calling the wild blackberry, also more romantically called the dewberry. But in 1885, the mustachioed horticulturist Luther Burbank imported the so-called Himalaya blackberry to North America, and it has now happily colonized every open space not covered by concrete or asphalt. Burbank is somewhat infamous for his shoddy record keeping, and botanists would later find that his Himalaya blackberry had actually been exported to Germany from Armenia before Burbank ever got hold of it. So Burbank would never have guessed that the Armenian blackberry would become so pervasively dominant in the western United States, or that it would eventually erase the cultural traces of our native Pacific Northwest blackberry. So here in the 21st century, if you ask the majority of folks about blackberries, they will undoubtedly describe the Armenian newcomer rather than the native wild blackberry. In July, it's easy to tell when you are in the presence of blackberry consciousness. Just mention that your weekend plans include some blackberry picking and watch the response. Most people will be embarrassed for you. They'll kick the dirt and say, "It's a little early, isn't it?" But those who know will look you in the eye, recognize a fellow blackberry seeker, then just nod and say nothing at all. They understand that wild blackberry picking is for sentimental fools, poetic vagabonds willing to discard common sense to spend a summer day wandering twisting mountain byways in a freewheeling exploration of the essence of things. They also understand that a fruit-laden patch of wild blackberries is a secret worth keeping. Normally I'm more of a pragmatist, but a haze of blackberry perfume from those 4 berries had now permeated every cranny of my brain, displacing worry, anchoring me in a present that was also my past. Climbing back into the car after my impromptu rest stop, I continued driving toward Smith River. The narrow pavement was a black ledge hung from a vertical wall of brown sandstone above a precipitous drop into dense summer foliage. Foxglove was in peak bloom, 3 feet tall and sporting tubular pink flowers. I had no expectation that the day would lead to anything more than a mouthful of berries and childhood remembrances. 4 wild blackberries do not make a pie. Besides, I'd eaten them. But there were more berries. They were scattered along the roadside in small patches, and I soon learned that by driving very slowly with the window down, I could spot them. Briefly, I wondered how long it would take me to cross the United States at this speed. Window open, peering for blackberry-sized objects. Then the gray sky closed in, gliding so low over the mountains that its gauzy road caught in the ridge tops as it passed, leaving ragged pieces clinging to the tallest trees. and a light mist began to fall that gradually became a drenching drizzle. Lunchtime was 2 hours away, but I ate my sandwich anyway to free the container for the berries that seemed destined to fill it. Time gradually disappeared until there was only the car and the road wound inextricably together like music and musician in a meandering melody punctuated intermittently by blackberry breaks. My failures, doubts, false expectations of myself faded into some quiet, mist-filled canyon in my mind. I began to hope. Perhaps there were enough blackberries along the next 6 miles of road to make a pie. A 9-incher would need 4 cups. After an hour and a half, the sandwich container was heaping full, and in my generous estimate, there were 2 cups of berries. Hope grew to expectation with each successful stop, and I finally surrendered completely to the process. All I needed was time, and today the hours had become limitless. Because lunchtime was by now legitimately close, I decided to eat a piece of chocolate cake that was taking up valuable space in a quart-sized freezer bag and began filling that with berries too. Over the course of the morning, I had discovered that ripe berries were found only along the shoulder of the road. This pattern was so predictable that I had developed the half-baked hypothesis that on sunny spring days, the pavement absorbed more heat, radiating it back into the surrounding air, creating a slightly warmer microclimate. This microcosm of global warming had accelerated the wild blackberry season by a week or 2. Even in the face of pavement-induced climate change, ripe berries were in extremely short supply. Scarcity often gives birth to frugality. I skimped on taste testing, and in lieu of eating my hard-won fruit, I periodically waved purple-stained fingers under my nose, sending that blackberry bouquet floating through my brain and setting my pleasure sensors firing like the rapid thumping of a drumming grouse. Chemistry was never my strong suit. Oh man, is that true? And I don't know what sort of aromatic compounds give blackberries their distinctive nose. Whatever they are, wild blackberries have concentrated this essence into a very small package. That blackberry scent coalesced into a pie that seared itself into my imagination. I became driven by the vision of it, picking every berry with any prospect of adding to that steamy purple filling, barely ripe, partially fermented, tiny, large, half-eaten by chipmunks. Surely this mix would give my pie what the wine folks call complexity. Speaking out loud, I promised the animals that I would leave some. The talk was cheap, and I searched for every dropped berry as if I had lost my wedding ring. The rain subsided and sunlight burned slowly through the vapor. Parking at a turnout above the 3-mile downgrade toward Upper Smith River Road, I discovered that here, for reasons known only to the blackberries, they were especially plentiful. I became a delirious bear, weaving from one side of the road to the other, popping berries into my freezer bag. The return to the car provided a slightly different view, revealing a few more berries. I allowed myself to take serious stock of the situation. Opening the rear door, I placed the bulging freezer bag next to the heaping sandwich container. There was no doubt I had enough berries for one unadulterated wild blackberry pie.